Amen.
All right, everybody. So last week we started off by basically going through all of the numbers. We started with the gut triad 891. We gave a quick definition of the numbers, and then Hunter basically talked about what spiritual growth looks like for each of the numbers during the COVID pandemic, during the extended quarantine time. Tonight, what we've decided we're going to do is we're going to identify the core sins that are affiliated with each of the 9 numbers on the Enneagram. And then Hunter's also, he's going to talk about those, but then also what are the virtues that we need to pay attention to help liberate us from those sins or from those tendencies. So I wanted, before I turn it over to him, I wanted to read 2 things. The first was a verse from Romans that has been referred to before as the most accurate description of the human condition or predicament, Romans 7, verse 15, where Paul says, I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing that I hate. And then I'd like to call your attention to another book that last week I told you, the Ian Cron book, Ian Cron, Suzanne Stabile, The Road Back to You. This week, and I've lifted this up at Woodmont before, it's called The Enneagram and the Way of Jesus, written by a guy named A.J. Sherrill, who's a pastor up in Michigan, I believe. And so this is a couple of resources for you to have. So, Hunter, welcome back. Thanks for being with us again. And I'll let you kind of give some introductory remarks. And I think tonight we're not going to start with 8s. I think we're going to start with 1s when we get going. So
That's right.
Switch up the order a little bit. So welcome back, Hunter.
Well, thank you. It's really good to be back and good to see so many familiar faces online and those that I haven't gotten to meet in person. Hopefully we'll have the opportunity to do some Enneagram work not too long from now in person too. But so when Clay and I were talking about what would be some topics for these Wednesday night conversations, one of the things that I'm really passionate about talking about is what we're going to discuss tonight. And that's the distinction between the Enneagram passions or sins and the virtues. And so before we even kind of jump into the numbers, let me kind of give you a big picture idea of what we're even talking about and how the Enneagram talks about virtues and passions. I'm going to kind of use tonight passions and sins in an interchangeable way because in classic Enneagram literature and teaching, there are 9 kind of besetting passions that we're going to explore, one for each of the 9 numbers tonight. When some members of the Jesuit community in the 1970s got a hold of the Enneagram, they kind of recharacterized those passions as sins. And so you might see, if you're reading different Enneagram books or listening to different teachers, you might hear them talked about interchangeably as passions or sins, but they kind of means the same thing in Enneagram wisdom. And I kind of like to use passions because I think in a way, when we explore the passions for each number, we'll see how the passion itself is kind of morally neutral, but it can give birth to a lot of sin in our lives. And so the big picture Enneagram idea here is this. The Enneagram says that we all carry in us a soul, right? Paul might characterize it in Colossians as a Christ in you and a Christ in me. We learn as part of the Christian story that we all bear out some part of God's image. We all have kind of an essence. So this kind of soul, this essence, this Christ in you, Christ in me, the image of God that we carry is characterized for each of us really clearly by one virtue, one of God's virtues, one of Christ's virtues that we particularly, based on our makeup, our personality, really get to carry out. However, because life intervenes and we all have kind of these childhood wounds and intervening experiences in life that just come and kind of layer on personality, which is represented through our Enneagram type. Because that happens, the virtue in us gets kind of covered up. It's almost like the virtue, which is the most pure and vulnerable part of us, we begin to kind of protect that virtue as life kind of hits us, and we protect it with layers and layers and layers of personality. And ultimately, that personality is characterized by the passions. So here's the kind of news flash for tonight that we're going to talk about with each of the 9 numbers. Is we've been characterized by our passions. If you've come to an Enneagram Know Your Number, if you've read an Enneagram kind of introductory book, you've probably learned about the passion or the sin for each number. That's kind of how we know ourselves. That's kind of how we perceive one another. But the passion is actually covering the virtue. And so the passion seems like it's the truest part of us, but it's not. It's the part of us that's connected to kind of the mask or the false self that we wear. So our work is to explore the Enneagram to help us see how the passion might kind of fall away a little bit, to uncover and to reveal the virtue. And when we go through each of these for each number, you're going to see that the passion and the virtue are kind of opposites of each other. You know, when we talk a minute about 2s, we'll talk about the passion being pride, but the virtue being humility. They're just kind of opposites. And so the beautiful thing the Enneagram tells us is the thing that we get wrong the most, pride for me, actually is the opposite of what's truest about us, the virtue, the Christ in us that we carry, the image of God that we carry, that we're invited to walk into as the passion falls away so the virtue can be revealed. And so I wanted to talk about this because when we're living big time in personality, when personality is taking over, the passion really gets whipped up. But when we are allowing kind of personality to sort of fall away in our truer self, our souls to kind of emerge, the virtues will become clearer. So I think the best test for all of us of how well we're doing at any given moment. Are you healthy? Are you unhealthy? Are you doing well with Enneagram work? Or is personality taking over? The test is, do you see the passion or do you see the virtue showing up in your life more, or showing up in that choice, showing up in that decision? So I want to now kind of...
I just want to add one thing really quick before you dive into the ones. For me as a pastor, there were 2 main reasons why the Enneagram really resonated for me. And the first one was every Christian I know talks about wanting to grow in their faith and grow in their spiritual life, but there have not been many tools that have helped people identify what they need to focus on and where they need to start. The second thing that I find just fascinating about the Enneagram is it really helps with marriage and family dynamics and understanding relationships and why people act the way that they act. And it gives spouses and family members a tool to just better understand each other and how they're wired. So I wanted to put that on there. The spiritual growth piece for sure, because everybody wants to grow spiritually, but far fewer people know where to start.
Absolutely. And that's so important, Clay, to keep in mind. And the beautiful thing about the Enneagram is it tells us, there's a difference between change and transformation. I've talked about this. Some of you heard me say this before, but it applies to the passions and virtues. Change is kind of when we take things on. We kind of white knuckle our way to change. We kind of grit and bear it to get to change. But transformation, which is so much of the spiritual life, is really when old things fall away. So the work that the Enneagram invites us to is when we learn about the passion for each number, it's not to say, okay, this is the passion or the sin that really is kind of besetting to my Enneagram number. What 10 steps do I need to take? What do I need to do? How do I go get the virtue? The goal of the Enneagram is to allow that knowledge and that wisdom to help us to just allow that passion to fall away, to open our hands so that the virtue can emerge. So that's why the Enneagram is kind of a transformation tool.
All right, let's dive in with the ones.
Let's dive in. So ones, the passion or the sin for ones is anger. And really anger is kind of a misnomer because ones don't typically express straight up anger. The anger that ones experience mostly is resentment. And any anger that they experience or that they express is first directed internally to themselves. Ones are most angry with themselves at the ways in which they have not been able to measure up or have not been able to do things as well as they feel like they should have been able to do them. But sometimes that gets expressed to other people. It gets expressed kind of outside of themselves. and it gets expressed as kind of resentment, where ones feel like they've been keeping this standard. They've been doing their best. They've been meeting the mark for years, but everybody else hasn't quite kept up their end of the bargain. Everybody else hasn't worked as hard as they have worked or kept the same standards that they've kept. And so ones can be sometimes externally resentful towards other people because of that. So anger or resentment is the passion for ones. It's the thing that characterizes their personality. It drives them, it motivates them. But the beautiful news is that the virtue for ones to be uncovered that lives behind the anger is serenity. And serenity is, first of all, involves an acceptance of self. Ones have a really critical inner monologue that tells them that they don't quite measure up. And so that's why a lot of that anger is self-directed. But the virtue of serenity first invites ones to kind of open up to some self-love, some compassionate, non-judgmental self-awareness and self-talk. That's the first step, because if ones can get to a quieter mind, a mind where the interior monologue of negative feedback and negative voices is not as loud and is not as prevalent, the quiet mind, the self-acceptance helps ones to move into a place of serenity, which kind of looks like balance. It looks like non-dualistic thinking. It looks like one's being able to make room for the both and, not the either or, this is all bad or all good or all right or all wrong. That's the serenity that ones are invited into. Because resentment is kind of an internal chaos. But serenity is an internal peace, an internal balance, an internal equilibrium. So the beautiful thing that all this passions and virtues work invites us to recognize and know is, one's the truest part of you is actually a capacity for serenity. The part of you that maybe most clearly bears out the qualities of Christ and the image of God is this serenity ability. But it gets covered by personality, and that personality actually makes us think that anger is the truest part of you, and it's not. But as we can find tools to help the anger fall away, the serenity can come up, and ones can have a quieter mind, more peace in relationships, more joy, more balance, more contentment.
Hunter, why are ones so hard on themselves?
Ones are so hard on themselves because they live with the childhood wounding message that says it's not okay to make mistakes and you should be able to be perfect. And that's just a message that ones hear. And how do these messages come to us in childhood? It's a mix, of the way that we're wired and the experiences in the life environment that kind of surrounds us. But so ones are motivated by that message. And that's why there's so much self-directed anger at the ways in which they haven't been able to measure up or haven't been able to meet that standard that they feel like they should have been able to meet.
So everybody else thinks that ones have a really high standard for them because of their expectations, but ones have already set the bar immensely high for themselves, in addition to wanting everybody else to play by the rules and do what's right.
It is. That's a compassion point for the Enneagram, is to remember that whenever you feel like a one is maybe set a standard that's really high for you or been a little hard on you, always remember that the one has been harder on themselves. And sometimes when ones are critical to other people, that's kind of because they almost need to balance the playing field a little bit because they've been so critical to themselves.
All right, let's move on to twos, the helper.
So I'm a two. So this is always kind of exposing, the passion or the sin for twos is pride. And we kind of have to give an Enneagram definition for all of these passions because it's a little bit different than the pride we think of every day. Twos are okay playing kind of second chair. They don't have to be the boss. They don't have to get the prize. It's not so much pride in accomplishments. But what pride is for twos is twos feel like that they're okay. Look away. Don't look at me. I'm fine. I'm good, which means I have all of my energy and all of my resources to devote to saving and fixing and rescuing you. So twos have this pride of place where it's this idea that They put themselves in the seat of the fixer or the rescuer or the savior for other people all the time. Sometimes twos are intervening in people's lives in areas where people haven't even asked them to intervene. It's like sometimes people look around and think, woo, did I even ask you to help with that? Or did I ask you to jump in there? But a two is jumped in. And that's connected to the passion of pride for twos. And the biggest thing in pride is this kind of lack of self-awareness or lack of self-acknowledgement that as the two, we have needs as well. We're not okay all the time. We're not fine all the time. We're not without feelings or needs. But twos kind of push those down and sort of make themselves indispensable rescuers and fixers in other people's lives, and that's pride. But the virtue for twos is humility. And what that means for twos is that twos are invited to recognize that inside of them, the virtue lives in them. And the virtue that lives most clearly in them as twos is the virtue of humility, which says, I'm not always okay. I'm not always fine. I may not be the one who's able to help today because I may be the one who's in need of help. That's what humility looks like for twos. And that's so tricky and hard for twos because twos don't want the attention put on them. They don't want them to be the ones who are being helped. They want to kind of be known as the helpers and the rescuers of other people. But humility comes in to say, it's me, Lord, standing in the need of prayer. It's me who's not always fine. It's me who may need to be helped. And that's the humility that's got to be uncovered and revealed in twos. So twos walk toward that humility when they're able to be vulnerable, when they're able to ask for help, when they're able to receive help, when they're able to not jump in and intervene every time there's a hole that needs to be filled or a problem that needs to be fixed.
Do twos try to make themselves indispensable? Do they try to put themselves into situations where they know they're going to be needed or where they know they can help others?
They do, because sadly, when we're deep in personality, twos don't believe that we can be loved unless we are helpful. And so we kind of make ourselves indispensable in some ways because that's kind of the substitute for love, when we're not doing well in our personalities. So twos do, they jump in. And that's why twos often, for some season of life, have to kind of wrestle with and recognize a tendency toward codependent behavior, and maybe do some codependent or enabling work, because twos can kind of fall into that.
All right, let's move on to threes, the achiever, performance-oriented number.
Absolutely. So threes, their passion is deceit. But I got to tell you, that sounds rough for threes. Threes don't love it when I say that. Kind of like we talked about for ones, is the anger is really mostly self-directed. For threes, the deceit is a self-deceit. Threes are not trying to pull the wool over anybody's eyes. What deceit is about for threes is that threes are so adaptable and flexible. They are able to come into any context and change and shift their shape and adapt and flex, so that if they're in one church or one family or one community, they can figure out, what do I need to do to be successful here? But then they can be dropped into another church or another community or another job. And they'll figure out very quickly, how do I need to shift and change to be successful here? And they do it really well. So the deceit is kind of about this chameleon nature that threes have, but it's all about self-deceit. Threes are never trying to change explicitly. It's this subconscious adaptability and flexibility that's just intuitive to threes. And it's, remember, the Enneagram kind of reminds us that the best part of us is the worst part, and the worst part is the best part. So there's no judgment about that. It's part of what makes threes successful. It's part of what makes them great leaders, because they can adapt and change. But the deceit passion is about, as they've adapted and changed, they've lost touch with who they truly are internally. They've lost touch with maybe their own sense of self and calling. So I love to tell this story. Parker Palmer is a Quaker kind of spiritual writer, and he's a student and a kind of devotee of the Enneagram, and he's a 3 on the Enneagram. And at one point in Parker Palmer's life, he was invited to be the president of the University of California at Berkeley, which seems like a big prize, right? I mean, that's a big deal. If you're that, you can kind of write your ticket to whatever else you want to do the rest of your life. So because he's a Quaker, part of the way that Quakers do discernment is in these kind of circles of trust, these kind of clearness committees. And so he's kind of going through the motions of this. Really, he's made up his mind that he's going to go on and take this job. But he's doing this kind of discernment group that his Quaker community kind of encouraged people to do. And so in this, people are asking him questions, what do you want to do? Why would you want to take this job? What would be good about this job? And people keep saying, what would you like about being the president of this college? And he says, well, I know it would take a lot of time away from my family. I know it'd be kind of tough. And no, I'm sorry. You must not have heard our question. What would you love about being president of the college? And he said, well, I know it'd be a lot of work that, it'd really be a big lifestyle change. And, again, they redirect, well, hold on, what would you love? And finally he gets the point, and he kind of laughs at himself, and he said, well, to be honest, I'd love to have my picture in the paper with a blurb under it that says Parker Palmer, president of the University of California at Berkeley. And he was able to kind of laugh and realize maybe this isn't the job for me. But you see, 3s, the deceit is they're just so good at being successful and flexible that like Parker Palmer, they are tempted all the time to kind of lose touch with what they really want, who they really are, what they really would like to do, because they've been rewarded for being so flexible and adaptable. But the virtue for 3s is truthfulness. And truthfulness is about an inner ability to really name who you are and live it. Because you see, 3s, they're living so many different lives. They're changing and adapting and losing touch with who they really are. So the virtue that can emerge from 3s as deceit falls away is this virtue of truthfulness. So when you see 3s kind of really living into that God virtue, that Christ quality of truthfulness, what that means is that they're really living their identity, their truth, their passion, their calling, and they're not shifting themselves or reshaping themselves just to be what it would take to be successful in each context. And that's a beautiful thing. So 3s, when you hear people say you're a chameleon, you're deceitful, know that actually the truest thing that we could say about you is that you have the virtue of truthfulness, but it's been covered and masked by this deceit ability, and it's waiting. The truthfulness is waiting. So 3s, the way you find your way to truthfulness is you got to figure out what's true about you in all seasons of life. And that's the foundational building blocks for discovering who you really are and what you really want to be.
And so in American culture, we glorify 3s because they can be workaholics, they can be very successful. But how does a 3 differentiate between what are the expectations of other people versus what do I really want out of life?
Absolutely. Well, it really requires some interior work. And that's why I say the first thing is for 3s, go back through all the seasons of life that you've lived, all your jobs, all the places you've lived, all the relationships you've had, and figure out what are the things that have been true about you in every one of those seasons. Those are your foundational building blocks. Those are your clues to discovering who you really are.
Okay. All right, let's go to 4s. Last week we referred to them as the romantics, but the 4s are very unique, very artsy. What is their passion?
Yeah, 4s, the passion for 4s is envy, which 4s aren't envious of your house or your job or your kids or your car or anything. They're envious of the way in which they perceive that the rest of us get to be normal and they don't get to be normal. You see, 4s feel offbeat. They feel misunderstood. They feel like something internally is missing. And they're kind of on this lifelong existential quest to figure out what it is inside them that's missing, or why it is that they're kind of out of step with the world in some way. And so there's this envy that comes up with fours as they kind of that isolate themselves by feeling separated, by feeling like all the rest of you all are normal and get to have regular lives and don't have as much existential angst as I have. And that continues to isolate the four and make the four sometimes feel like they're a victim of circumstance. And it leads to that passion of envy where they envy the ease that other people have of just living in the world. But the virtue for fours, and this is kind of a $20 word, it's equanimity. And that's not a word we use every day. Equanimity, EQUANMITY, equanimity.
Another
And
word for being
equanimity,
calm. Being calm, is
yeah,
that?
it's absolutely, that's a big piece of it. It's a balancing, it's a forsaking of ideal images. It's a kind of idea that things are whole already. It's kind of connected to the serenity for ones. There's a balancing, there's an evenness, there's a calmness, there's a sense that nothing's missing. I'm perfect just as I am. I'm flawed, but we're all flawed. Other people don't have it easier than I do. Just my problems are different than other people's problems, and theirs are different than mine. So the virtue of equanimity actually allows fours to bring this wholeness to bear, bring this balancing and this openness to the whole. It allows them to forsake ideal images of who they should be, or what they wish they were, or how they wish they could get on in the world. So even though sometimes fours feel a little interiorly like chaotic, like it's chaotic inside. Fours feel like that sometimes. Their inner experience is a little chaotic because emotions are swinging. The virtue that's waiting to be revealed and uncovered in fours is equanimity, which is again a balancing, a wholeness, a stability. And that's some of what fours can kind of live into and needs to be revealed, which is going to temper the chaotic swings of emotion and is going to temper the passion, which sometimes of envy, which tells them that everybody's normal and they're not, because that's not true. Everybody's just as messed up as you are, fours. That's the news flash. They just may have figured out how to make it all look better on the surface, but we don't live in glass houses, so that's the virtue for fours to really uncover.
So isn't it interesting that fours say that they're not understood by other people and they envy, the normal lifestyles of other people. But at the end of the day, fours don't really want to be understood, right? They really like the fact that they're unique and different and march to their own beat.
Exactly. It's part of the push-pull of fours. It's like, I'm envious of the way that you're normal, but the worst thing in the world would be to be normal. Or, I'm envious of how stable your life is, but I don't really want a regular stable life. Fours live in that push-pull. And the equanimity is about finding the balance between that, finding the balance between being unique and also joining the whole human race. Being special, being different, but also seeing yourself as part of a whole. That's what fours are invited to kind of live into. Fours feel misunderstood, but one of my kind of pieces of encouragement to fours in Enneagram work is we all feel misunderstood. I mean, I don't know that the goal of life is to be understood by other humans. Maybe the goal is more to kind of be seen and held and loved and received by others. Because if we're waiting for everybody to understand us, sometimes we might be waiting a long time. But what we can offer other people is we can offer this more empathy of saying, I don't fully understand your life experience. I don't fully understand exactly the ways in which you're wired, but I do make room for all of you, and I want to receive all of you, and I want to be able to hold space for all of you.
All right, let's move on to fives. The investigator, the ones who preserve their energy and hoard knowledge, and did okay at the beginning of the pandemic, and might still be doing okay now.
They're doing better than a lot of us. Yeah, fives are living their best quarantine life still.
Right.
It's going to take this going on a lot longer before fives are starting to be like, hey, come on, you got to open the world back up again.
Right.
So the passion for fives is greed. And kind of like you mentioned, Clay, what fives are greedy about is not money. It's fives are greedy about time, affection, energy, um, and privacy, and the few resources that are necessary, which sometimes is money and things, to maintain a private, independent existence. So fives are greedy for time and energy and effect. They feel like they don't have enough. And that's connected to their childhood wound, which leads them into kind of a scarcity mentality where they're not quite sure the world is abundant. So it's kind of like, if I give you my time or if I give you my affection, it might just be gone. There might not be more where that came from. That's part of the childhood wound that fives live into. So the passion of greed kind of sets in as fives kind of hoard what they have, or they try to accumulate more. A lot of what fives are accumulating is actually it's head stuff, information, research, knowledge. They're also accumulating time and energy and emotion. And that's why sometimes people in relationships with fives are sometimes looking for a little bit more intimacy or affection in some way. But the virtue for fives is non-attachment, which is a big difference from detachment. Detachment is like pulling yourself away, stepping way back, detaching. Fives do that too much. Non-attachment is about holding your hands like this and saying, I can have things, I can have time, I can have energy, I can have resources, but I don't have to hold them like this. I can be kind of non-attached to them and know that if I spend some, that's okay, there's more. Know that if I release some time or energy or affection or resources to you, that the universe will send some back to me at the right place. This kind of place of non-attachment, because greed invites fives to do this, but the virtue of non-attachment invites them to open up. So a lot of that really comes in relationally. Fives are really invited into the virtue of non-attachment relationally, because fives hold a lot of themselves back because they feel like if they give themselves away, they'll run out. And fives are invited to sort of bring themselves fully into the relationship, bring themselves fully into the situation, and trust that you won't run out, and trust that if the other person takes some from you, that God will fill you back up again in all the right ways, that you're stronger, you're more resilient, you have more energy and more affection in you than you think you have. And so fives are invited to sort of pay attention to greed tendencies and allow some of that to fall away as you live into an abundance mindset, so that non-attachment can set in. And non-attachment, remember, doesn't mean detachment. It doesn't mean you can't have anything. It doesn't mean you have to let go of everything. It just means you hold things loosely. Fives are used to holding things tightly, but non-attachment invites fives to hold things loosely.
So fives are very much concerned with being depleted.
Absolutely.
They're going to measure their energy, they're going to measure their time, they're going to measure their resources, and make sure that they don't run out. And what you're saying is that fives need to think more about investment, and how you can give of yourself, and that would actually be a good thing. It wouldn't something might come back if
That's
you
a
give
great
more
language.
of yourself. All right.
I think the language of investment is really good for fives, because fives sometimes feel like if they give it away, they've spent it. But I think there is an invitation to think about as you give away some what you have that you're investing in, and it's not actually becoming less, it's becoming more somehow.
All right, let's move on to sixes, the loyalists who we talked about last week, struggle with fear and worst case scenario thinking. What's the passion for sixes?
The passion for sixes is fear. And really, it's best characterized as anxiety, because anxiety is sort of like the mood music. It's kind of the elevator music that accompanies sixes through life. It's sort of just always there. It's always kind of playing. They just kind of hear it. And so that's why sixes do a lot of worst case scenario planning. That's why they make plan Bs and plan Cs and plan Ds. That's why they kind of come into rooms and notice where the exits are. They ask questions that other people don't ask. So that fear is the passion, and the fear is is connected to their wound that says the world's dangerous and don't trust yourself. And so the virtue for sixes is courage. And I want to say a few things about courage. One, courage is really about trusting your own internal guidance. Sixes, you're used to always looking for reference points outside of yourself for support, always looking for people or systems of belief that seem stronger or more knowledgeable to help you navigate the dangers of the world. But courage is actually about trusting your own gut, trusting your own inner instinct, following your own kind of North Star, following your own relationship with God and what you've come to know of your spiritual life, not always needing other people to sort of help inform and influence what your spiritual life should be or could be. And so courage is the virtue in sixes. So you see, again, the way that these work, it's like courage is there for sixes, but then life intervenes and that courage gets kind of protected and covered by fear and anxiety. But as the fear and anxiety can fall away, as the passion can fall away, the virtue of courage can emerge. And Enneagram wisdom uses the word courage, and I think that's important. But I think because we're talking about the Enneagram from a Christian perspective, we should also just talk about faith, because I think faith is even a deeper place than courage. Courage, sometimes we have to kind of like muster our way to courage. But faith is about the transformative experience of saying, kind of like Frederick Buechner said, here's the world. Beautiful and terrible things will happen. Be not afraid. Faith is more of that posture. Faith is Jesus saying in John 16, you're going to have trouble in this world. I promise you that. But take heart because I've overcome the world. And so sixes are invited to see that I think the gift of faith, the capacity for the gift of faith is inside them. But it's been distorted by the fear and anxiety. But as fear and anxiety falls away, the courage and I think the gift of faith can actually emerge for sixes.
So sixes basically need to trust and have faith that even though bad things do happen and will happen, things are still going to be okay. And
right.
it doesn't mean that life's going to be perfect.
Something. Absolutely. Sixes can kind of, especially from a spiritual journey, discover the sense in which bad things will happen, but I'm tethered to God. I'm tethered to the Christian story. I'm tethered to my brother and my sister and my neighbor in ways that can't be broken, even by the bad things of life that will happen.
So I thought it was interesting. Last week, you made the comment that in terms of COVID, that sixes are perhaps doing better than everybody else because everybody else comes in and starts worrying, and sixes had already worried. That they're like, I've already worried about this. Yeah, I knew it was going to be bad. Now it's bad, and now they've kind of moved on to something else. And so what you're saying is sixes can fill that with courage and faith that things are going to get better. At some point, things are going to get better, and it's going to be okay, even though none of us planned on this year.
Totally. And one of the reasons too why sixes are doing kind of better than some of the rest of us in COVID is sixes feel like they need to worry for the rest of us when we're not worried. So like when the rest of us are just kind of rocking along in our lives, not worried about all the things, sixes feel like it's their responsibility to worry about them. But because now we've got kind of like universal worry is high in some ways. We're all kind of worried about this. Sixes feel like they can kind of step down from the watchtower and let some of the rest of us take over for a minute. All
right. Okay, let's move on to sevens, the enthusiast, moving on from one adventure to the next. What's the passion of the sevens?
The passion for sevens is gluttony. And it can be expressed in anything. It doesn't have to be about food. It's about an insatiable desire for more. Sevens can't be filled up. They're like a bottomless pit for experiences and adventure and new. So gluttony is the passion for sevens. And it takes lots of forms. Sometimes it takes the form in a substance or food or shopping or exercise. Sometimes it takes the form in something that looks kind of healthy and good, but actually on, deeper observation, it's just too much. But the virtue for sevens is sobriety. And so here's the thing I like to say, sevens get kind of caricatured in Enneagram work, right? We kind of think about sevens as the every day's a snow day kind of people. But the beautiful thing about the virtues discipline for the Enneagram reminds us that sevens have a deeper capacity for sobriety than all the rest of the 9 members. It's just that true part of them, that part of their essence and their soul has been masked and covered by the passion of gluttony that's got to fall away for sobriety to emerge. So sobriety for sevens is the ability to have a clear mind and a clear focus and a clear intention without always needing more and more and more. It's the ability to be content. It's the ability to experience the joy in the mundane. It's the ability to do something over again without needing it to be different and to enjoy it. So sobriety is really important for sevens to kind of embrace as a part of themselves, because sometimes sevens make themselves the butt of the joke. They kind of make the joke before other people can sometimes. So they kind of live into the gluttony thing, the more, the adventure. But sevens need to learn to embrace their capacity for a sober joy. And that sobriety and that sober joy only comes as they learn to tap into the softer, more negative, more tender, more vulnerable feelings that usually they try to avoid. And they try to just kind of stay in the positive, uplifting, joy-filled feelings.
Do sevens feel like everybody else is counting on them for entertainment and to be the social chairman? I mean, is there the social element that, like, if I don't come up with a plan, then nobody's going to have fun? Or if I don't make this party fun, then it's going to end really early. Do they put pressure on themselves to be the entertainer?
They do. And most of the time they like it, except when they don't. But yeah, they do. They feel kind of some sense of pride in that role many times in a family or in a community. But that's the tricky thing, is we come to expect that from sevens. And all we're doing when we expect that from sevens is we're just feeding that personality monster. We're helping that layer of personality for sevens become so thick that it's harder for it to be kind of uncovered and uncover some truer, deeper stuff, like sobriety.
All right, let's move on to the most important number on the Enneagram, which is 8s. Just kidding. 8s is called the challenger, the leader, commanding intense, confrontational. 8s are motivated by need to be in control. So what's the core passion for 8s?
The core passion for 8s is lust. And the idea is not sexual in nature. It's a lust for intensity. It's a lust for control, and it's a lust for life. It's like 8s feel a little bit, they're lusty in the sense that if it's not intense, it usually doesn't feel intimate to 8s. Whenever I'm doing kind of marriage work or couples work with people who are 8s, with a partner who's not an 8, that's something that always comes up is the 8 always kind of needs to find some way to express that if it's not intense, it doesn't feel intimate, because 8s have the passion of lust that it's kind of connected to the 7 gluttony of just more, new. They're headed to the future. They're goal oriented. They've got a lust for not being content. They're already making plans and executing them for the future. And the thing about the lust is it's a little bit of a worldly kind of cynicism too, because 8s grew up quicker than the rest of us, in the sense that 8s were younger than the rest of us were when they discovered not everybody means well. And not everybody has always got my best interest at heart. 8s kind of wised up to that a little earlier, which is why the virtue for 8s is innocence, is asking 8s not to return to some childlike innocence that's naive and gullible. It's a mature innocence that is connected to this idea that it's like, yeah, people are not always who they say they are. People aren't always trustworthy, but I still choose to offer myself. Still choose to offer my heart, even knowing that it could be hurt, even knowing that my trust could be betrayed. The innocence that 8s are invited to, that virtue of innocence, is kind of about having beginner eyes. 8s are savvy and they're worldly and they're lusty, and They have a lot of life experience, but what they need to do is they need to come into relationships and come into each day and each moment with a beginner set of eyes to say, let me experience this for the first time. That's what eights don't always do. They don't always come into things as if they're experiencing it for the first time with kind of the eyes of a child or with innocent eyes or beginner eyes. So the virtue of, eights don't love that their virtue is innocence, because that kind of feels, what in the world does that mean? But it's kind of why when emotion comes out in eights, it's so pure, it's so beautiful, it's so unguarded. And it's like there's this innocence that is emerging. Um, Innocence is also connected to, eights are authentic. They are who they are. And that's a beautiful quality of them. There's kind of an innocence to that as eights really live into just that authentic, this is who I am, take it or leave it. And I'm gonna try to be connected to you in intimate ways, but also this is who I am. That's part of that virtue of innocence. But whenever eights get too controlling, too ahead of the pack, too fast, that's usually when the passion of lust has come in and taken over, and they need to step back so that childlike innocence can emerge.
So would you say that eights need to be wise as to what battles they pick? And, you can't fight every battle. You can't, everything can't be confrontational. You're not going to ever experience peace in your life. Everything can't be intense all the time. So
Absolutely. And
the fruit
eights
of the,
need to be
yeah, the
totally,
fruit of the
sorry.
spirit. Well, the fruit of the spirit, gentleness or goodness.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
That's a really big one for eights. That's tricky for eights. And eights, it's really about boundary keeping for eights. Eights are keeping so many boundaries, and they've put up boundaries in so many places, but those walls get too thick and too fortified. And it's kind of like if you let that door open a little bit, if you let that, drawbridge down over the moat a little bit, that's the innocence. Let it down. Be a little bit more unguarded, a little bit more unboundaried in safe ways with people that really you want to connect with in deep ways.
All right, let's move on to the final number, which is nines, also called the peacemaker. Pleasant, laid back, accommodating, very much interested in not rocking the boat, keeping the peace, paying attention to the needs and desires of other people. What's the passion for nines?
The passion for nines is sloth. And that, nines kind of also hate that passion because it sounds like laziness, and it's not. What nines are lazy or slothful about is about their own stuff. They get lost doing things for other people that they would never do for themselves, and their own stuff goes undone. Their own lives go unlived in some ways because eights are going along and getting along with everybody else, keeping the peace, not stirring up conflict, not rocking the boat. And it means that their dreams and their goals and their true essence self hasn't necessarily been lived out. So there's kind of this slothful way in which nines kind of want to be unaffected by life. They don't want all the drama. They don't want all the conflict. They don't want all the problems. And so they kind of want to ease through life in this unaffected way. But what that means is they've given up so much of themselves, and they've given up so many of their dreams. So sloth is connected to the idea that a lot of nines have kind of a regrets analysis at some point of life where they realize, I didn't get to the things that I meant to get to. And that's why the virtue for nines is action. And action is not just about doing to do. It's about taking action for your own sake, doing the things that you need to do to propel and push your life forward. You see, nines they have two modes. They kind of have on or off. And if they're on, they're busy, 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 but sometimes they're busy in like a distracting way. They're busy doing so that they don't have to really do the things that are really theirs to do. Or sometimes nines are really off, where it's like it looks like sloth because they have turned off totally. But nines need to find the balance of right action, which is not an action that's just kind of directed anywhere. It's not a chaotic action. It's a disciplined, focused action to to put their needs and their dreams and their things that only they can and will do at the forefront and take action for them, even if it costs you a little bit of conflict, even if it costs you a little bit of peace, even if you're not sure if it's going to turn out exactly how you want it to turn out. That's the spiritual invitation for nines, is to right action.
So would you say that nines and twos are perhaps the ones who are the worst at self-care? Or would you say that there's a bunch of numbers on the Enneagram that are prone to not doing self-care because they're tending to everybody else's needs?
Ones and twos are you said twos and nines. Ones are in there too.
Okay.
Twos and nines are definitely in the numbers that struggle with self-care. I mean, those are two of the biggest numbers. Ones kind of fall in that as well. But absolutely, both of those numbers, all those numbers are kind of busy working on behalf of other people. And there's always an invitation for them to say, kind of, what are you not getting to that's yours to do? What have you left undone that really needed to have been done, and only you can or will do it? I mean, that's a really 50,000 foot test for, like, what are the right things for us to do? The right things for us to do are the things that only we can and will do. So it's like an obvious example. I mean, nobody else can be the parent to your child in exactly the way that you can be. So it's like, if you got a child, it's kind of an obvious right action to pour into that child in some way, right? But that idea gets globalized too into all of our work. It's like, what are the things that if I don't do them, nobody will get to them because it's something that I must do. That's the right action that nines are invited to take.
Okay. So before we kind of move into the question and answer time, Hunter, anything else that you'd like to add, just kind of broadly speaking, as it relates to the passions and the virtues and the numbers?
Well, what I really want to start adding to folks is usually the passions are taught without the virtues. And classically, they need to be taught together, because I want everybody to really see the virtue is the truer thing. And the passion is connected to the mask of personality. But the passion is kind of what we think is truer, but it's not. And so I want us to keep connecting those. So if you knew before tonight what your passion was, because you learned it in a Know Your Number workshop, now I want you to know the virtue too, because that's what needs to kind of be unearthed and uncovered and revealed in all of us.
And would you say that there are, in this Cheryl book, there are spiritual practices that go well with every number? In other words, there are specific things that a number can do to kind of get themselves moving in that direction.
I do.
There could be overlap, but there's unique things that each number can do to practice to spiritual formation.
Absolutely. And that book has got some really good spiritual practices. And I'll just say, for everyone, because the virtues are already deep down inside of us, I think any type of contemplative spiritual practice, whatever that is, there's a lot, in any book that you get about contemplative spirituality or work you do in that regard, any contemplative spiritual practice puts us closer to seeing the virtue emerge. Because contemplative spirituality is not kind of like doing oriented spirituality. It's kind of letting things fall away so that what's already there can emerge spirituality. Mm-hmm. And so I would just encourage people to, look into what do contemplative spiritual practices look like for them.
And then the last part is that because everybody has a number they go to when they're stressed and a number that they go to when they're healthy, should people pay attention to that stress number so that they can be aware when they need to do spiritual practices and self-care? Like, can that Absolutely. Be a trigger point to say, hey, I'm getting off the rails here. I need to get centered again.
It can. Absolutely. It definitely can. Recognizing where you go in stress. And if you just Google the Enneagram image, it's the line going away with an arrow pointing away from your numbers, where you go in stress. Recognizing when you are acting like that number will allow you to ask yourself, am I acting like that number in a healthy way that's helping me, or am I acting like that number in an unhealthy way that's hurting me? And that is a good thing. You know, I'll say this. I actually think this would be for our 2.0 passions and virtues conversation. But I think that the virtue most shows up when we live into the high side of our stress number. And I actually think the passion most shows up when we fall into the low side of our security number. If you're kind of new to the Enneagram and that's kind of some extra gobbledygook, ignore that. You know, we can come back to it another day. But if you've been doing Enneagram work for a while and you know some of that stress and security movement language, start to see how the passion really shows up when you're at the bottom of your security number, and start to see how the virtue shows up in the top of your stress number.
All right. I'm going to open it up to questions. I'm going to ask the first question because I lined up the series. This is a question for Hunter. It's a political season. Do you know the Enneagram number of Donald Trump and Joe Biden?
Gosh, you know, that's great. We have, it's like we've been talking about Trump.
Take a guess at it.
Yeah, we've been talking about Trump longer than, you know, Biden in terms of the Enneagram. So a lot of people think that Donald Trump might be a 3. You know, you can see some 3 tendencies just in the ability to kind of, he's had different lives and different shapes and different perspectives and he's been able to, you know, whether people like it or not, he's been able to adapt in a lot of ways, and kind of, sometimes that's looked a little chaotic to some people that thought, well, I thought you thought that in this season or thought something different then. And I really, you know, I don't know. I need to kind of, I don't know. I haven't seen Joe Biden enough in action to know. I'd be interested. I will say pretty much all Enneagram teachers, and I think he actually talks about the Enneagram himself, believe that Barack Obama was a 9. So anybody that kind of thinks about that, you know, presidency or season can kind of maybe see some of that 9 balancing and non-dualism sort of stuff that shows up in him. But he's often talked about as a 9.
You need more time
Clinton
figuring out what Biden is, okay? All right.
What now?
I said you need a little more time figuring out what Biden is.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to open it up for questions. I see Mary Welsh, so I'm going to try to scroll the screen, but Mary Welsh, you're up.
Okay. So in thinking about contemplative prayer and trying to really tap into a virtue, I mean, I am probably really more likely to go, oh, God, help me, or go for a spiritual walk. So, Hunter, I just want to be sure I'm hearing you correctly. Are you saying that the best way or the only way to tap into the virtue of, in my case, I'm a 7, so gluttony, as I just finished dinner, is my passion. Sobriety is my virtue. The only way or the best way to tap into sobriety is through contemplative prayer.
So thank you for that question, because I really want to make that clear to people. I think we'll take out only way. There's no only ways to any answer, to any questions. I do think contemplative spirituality is one of the best ways, but contemplative spirituality is not just centering prayer. So I think what you're talking about, that kind of like a centering prayer sit, which people teach in contemplative spirituality, is just one manifestation of a contemplative spiritual practice. Pilgrimage is a contemplative spiritual practice. Sacred meal, you know, there's active, you know, walking labyrinth. There's so many ways of participating in contemplative spirituality, and all of those are ways of in a way finding that unitive experience with God. That idea that we don't necessarily have to work our way to God. We kind of find ourselves already embraced and held in God. That's kind of the idea of contemplative spirituality, and the virtues idea is the same. It's kind of not trying to go get something that's outside of you. It's trying to uncover what really already is inside of you. But centering prayer is not the only contemplative spiritual practice.
And just FYI, our son built us a labyrinth in the side yard. You can be 6 feet apart. You're always welcome to come over.
I actually want to come do that. I'm going to invite myself over to do that, because I'm a labyrinth junkie. I love them.
You come on
All
over.
right.
Okay, good. Glad to know
Thank
that.
you very much.
Put your hand up if you got a question, or just go ahead and unmute and ask Hunter.
I have a question. At one of the Wednesday nights, you talked about 3 different things within each number. Like one was, I think, social and sexual or something like that. Does that have any effect on bringing out your virtue?
Not really. Those are kind of different disciplines. What you're describing is the Enneagram subtypes. And there's this idea that there are kind of social, sexual, and self-preserving versions of each number. And we can kind of shift through our life. So we might have a season that we're more sexual dominant or a season where we're more social dominant. And those words, have Enneagram definitions. Sexual is about kind of one-to-one intensity, and social is about how we relate to the group, and self-preserving is kind of about interior withdrawing space. But it's kind of a little bit, those are really called, in a way, kind of our social styles, and our way in which we sort of present and relate. And the virtue discipline's a little different. So you don't have to kind of marry those too much.
Good question. All right. Other questions? Hunter, do you think that people are fully capable of, I think people are capable of finding their own number, but fully capable of figuring out what they need to work on? Or do you think it's always better if somebody who is close to you, who knows you well, gives you input as well?
I think it's better if you can kind of find that on your own. It's always trickier for people that we love, particularly sometimes, how familiarity breeds contempt, particularly sometimes the people that are closest to us. It's really hard for them to prod us along in kind of the journey of transformation. So the best thing always is for people to kind of use this wisdom for themselves and discover how it applies to them and how they can see the virtue emerge in them. We always kind of want to use it for the people that we love. And there's sometimes healthy ways to use it in that way, but it always involves not using the language of the Enneagram. It always involves kind of finding different ways that don't create an insider outsider culture, to just kind of encourage people that we love to be able to be their truest self, which usually involves us just accepting them for who they are and not expecting the same thing from them today that we got from them yesterday, allowing them to change. We don't allow people we love to change very often. We kind of want them to fit into that family system's peg, where they've always fit. But if we can allow people to evolve and adapt and change, that's the best way that we can kind of let them work on themselves.
What about the criticism that when a lot of people have a hard time identifying their number, and they go to many workshops and they read the books, isn't it often because they're answering the test questions based on what they either think they are or they want to be, and it's not necessarily who they actually are? And so a spouse or a sibling or a very close friend can say, look, you might think that that's who you are, but I'm telling you, this is your number. And so there are people that will spend however much time thinking they are X number, and then later on, with the help of somebody like yourself or another person who knows it well, say, no, actually, this is what you are. So I guess I'm asking a question of self-deception, and that people answer the questions the way that they'd like to be.
Absolutely. That's one problem with the Enneagram tests. And that's why, in some ways, reading a long-form description of all the 9 types or listening to a description of all the 9 types is almost a better way to self-identify really what you are. But I think you're right, Clay. Sometimes when people have a lot of trouble getting to that kind of finish line, it is helpful to have a safe person kind of ask you some questions, kind of, mirror things for you. And then the people who really have a hard time discovering who they are, is I tell them to spend some time with 3, 6, and 9, because 3, 6, and 9 are the hardest numbers to identify. And there's different reasons for that, but those numbers are tricky sometimes. So usually people who spend a lot of time and still can't quite get to the finish line, they're either a 3, 6, or a 9.
Okay. Other questions for Hunter? And again, I can't see everybody, so if you have one, go ahead and unmute and start asking. Anybody else? All right, Hunter, I think you've answered everybody's questions. Before we wrap up, I'll put Hunter on the spot again and let him close us with prayer. I do want to say a couple things. I want to put a plug in. Hunter's got a book coming out fairly soon.
October 6th.
October 6th through InterVarsity Press. He is asked to write a book about the twos. So if you're a two, or you're married to a two, or you live with a two, you will want to pick that up. So it'll be out in about a month and a half. I had the chance to preview it and endorse it, and it's very good because he's writing not only with his expertise and knowledge, but also from personal experience. So that's coming up pretty soon. We will not have classes next Wednesday night, the 2nd, but we will pick back up on September the 9th. And there's actually a lot starting that night. One of the series will be a series put on by the Task Force for Racial Reconciliation. We're going to have 3 weeks where we hear from different people talking about the subject of race and what, as a church and as Christians, we can do to make a difference and to build bridges in our culture. So nothing next week, but that will start on the 9th. There are other classes being offered, Bible studies. All of that is in the Inspire. So check that out. And again, I want to thank Hunter for joining us and everybody for joining us. And I'll give him a round of applause.
It's been great to be with you all. I love the Woodmont community. I feel at home, and it's so wonderful. And I'm just excited to be on the Enneagram journey with all of you all.
Well, I'll let you close us out, and thank you
Absolutely.
again.
God, thank you for the opportunity to be together in this way. We thank you for all the ways in which you just put seeds of insight or wisdom into our lives. I pray that all that we've talked about with the Enneagram tonight, that it would just, the parts of it that are good for us to kind of take on and turn over in our heads and think about and mull over, that they would remain, and any parts of it that aren't helpful to us, help those just to fall away. I pray that you'll continue to give all of us good wisdom into how we can live into our best transformed selves, the part of us that honors you the most, the part of us that reflects the character and the qualities of Christ the most. Thank you for Clay. Thank you for Woodmont and their witness in our community and the world. Please give Clay and all our church leaders across the world wisdom and just a special sense of peace as they continue to help us figure out how to worship together, be together, but also be safe and be responsive to these times. And we pray all this in Christ's name. Amen.
Thank you, Hunter. One more thing. Next Tuesday night, there's not anything Wednesday, but the young professionals are having a speaker at 7:30, and it's about somebody who was formerly homeless, and he's going to tell his story and give some reflections on homelessness in our society. So Lauren and the YPs are putting that on. We'll put the Zoom link out. It'll be at 7:30 next Tuesday. All right. Thanks, Hunter. Thanks
so
everybody.
much. Good to see you all.